watching the reaction, we were watching at Martin Freeman's house, and the moment that dead Sherlock is suddenly standing by the graveside as John walks away, all our phones just went buzz, 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 you know. And it was a really thrilling feeling. Hello, I'm Mark Gatiss, and I'm here to tell you that I'm going to be breaking down constantly, breaking down some favourite scenes from my illustrious former career before lockdown for MCM Presents. Tickets are now on sale for an exclusive Q&A, the details of which will be in the video's description, probably somewhere here, like text on the screen in Sherlock land. Anyway, hope you enjoy. Oh, shut up, Mrs. Hudson. No, I had no idea that that line was a meme or a catchphrase or whatever it has become. It's very flattering, a bit strange. I remember feeling very uncomfortable with telling off Una because she's one of the greatest people in the world, and it was genuinely like sort of swearing at your mum.
Oh, shut up, Mrs. Hudson.
Mycroft!
Apologies.
Thank you.
Though to in fact shut up.
Comedy is intrinsic to Sherlock. It's not something that's grafted onto it. You know, our greatest inspiration for this show, apart from the very funny original stories, is the Billy Wilder IAL Diamond movie, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is an extremely funny film. Very sad, very melancholy, very beautiful, but also very, very funny. And we wanted to have some good times with the Baker Street Boys. So it's I mean, we talked, you know, right at the beginning about how actually it's a sort of flat share sitcom, Sherlock Holmes. It's two unlikely buddies sharing a flat. This strange, remote, geeky man and this very salt of the earth everyman doctor who doesn't understand him, and their misadventures with their lovely landlady and their pet policeman, and their even more reserved and distant and strange elder brother, me. And not everyone's elder brother. That's a twist too far. But you know, it's the comedy of sort of surprise and oddness and just the sheer. There's so much fun to be had from a character like Sherlock Holmes because he's actually, of course, you couldn't live with him. He's a monstrous creature. You only love him through fiction, but he says the things that nobody else will say. He'll just come out with it because he has no concept of social graces or who's who in politics or who's important in the world. He just cuts to the chase. So to sort of wind up a character like that and place him into any kind of given situation, hence the idea of Sherlock being Dr. Watson's best man. I remember Stephen saying to me when he first read the stories as a child and realised Dr. Watson was married, he thought, but that means Sherlock must have been the best man. And he'd had that idea all those years. What was that like? And then we thought, well, he would approach it like a case, wouldn't he? How do you crack the case of how to do a good speech? And that, you know, it fuels so much of the fun of it, really. So it was never, it's not a conscious thing. Again, it's not like adding detail. You're just going, this is what we do, this is why we enjoy it. Sometimes, you know, we found that a bit on Dracula. Sometimes we thought we would have to pull back a bit because we were actually having too much of a laugh when we were supposed to also be scaring people. But the mixture is fascinating. As with the mixture of adventure and melodrama in Sherlock, or the mixture of horror and comedy in Dracula, it's part of what we do. So, and the inspiration for Mycroft, as I've said many times, was very much Christopher Lee's version in that film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, in which Wilder and Diamond sort of go one step further than Conan Doyle did in filling in the details of the brothers' relationship. That, you know, Mycroft's 7 years older. He's cleverer than Sherlock, but he's lazy. In the books, he's enormously fat because he literally doesn't move from his lodgings, except from his lodgings to his office. And he is a sort of great sorting house. He is the government, it transpires. He's like the great mind behind all international power. But what Wilder and Diamond did in that film was make their relationship rather spiky. They don't get on. Mycroft kind of can't bear the idea he's got this out of control, loose cannon private detective brother. And we thought about it very much like Fraser and Niles Crane. You know, in Cheers, Fraser is this strange, pompous, aloof intellectual. He works brilliantly in Cheers. If you give him his own series, you can't spend a whole half hour with Fraser. What you need is an Uber Fraser. And that's how we thought of Mycroft and Sherlock's relationship. And Sherlock ends up being the sort of naughty kid, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. So there was that, and then also the British politician Peter Mandelson, who I eventually played on TV. We always struck us as a very sort of Mycroftian figure. And there has always been throughout time and politics the person who stands behind the monarch's throne and whispers in their ear, usually holding a file of some sort, knowing it's Dominic Cummings. But I don't think Mycroft would tolerate him.
Come across your type before in the forces. You won't catch me when the house is down.
Bet the bed, I'll bet as a boy. No sisters. I love that. No sisters. As if that explains everything.
We didn't burn him!
Wicker Man, yes. The Wicker Man is a huge influence on the League of Gentlemen. And I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that. I used to think I was the only person who knew about that film. It felt like it was on a lot when I was a kid. And then, of course, discovering what Stephen Rees and Jeremy all loved it too, and obviously other people did. There was a time when it was still a bit obscure. I suppose that's when we were first starting to do the League. Only a few people would nod and think, "Oh, I know where that's come from." But that's obviously why that policeman is Scottish, to reference Edward Woodward. And I mean, God, my goodness, there was so many. I used to think, there were maybe too many references sometimes in the League. We were actually slightly swamping it with references to other things, but there were so many lovely films we wanted to kind of pay tribute to and enjoy that sort of flavour of. We did actually put together a tape in those days of favourite things for Steve Bendler, the director, just in terms of our kind of key things, which included Kes and The Loved One. I remember the Tony Richardson movie of the Evelyn Waugh book about American cemeteries, with Rod Steiger as Mr. Joy Boy. There's an extraordinary scene where his enormous mother pulls over the fridge on top of herself, and it's just, she keeps saying, cranberry sauce, cranberry sauce. It never made it into anything, but I used to love that strange little grotesque moment. So there were loads and those references. Quatermass 2, Deliverance. I'm just thinking of the episodes and what we sort of did, there's a huge amount of Terror of the Autons, the Doctor Who story, and it's like a thread. Jeff, Mike and Brian worked for Autoplastics, which is the plastics firm in Spearhead from Space, etc., etc. So it's just replete with them, really. And we did a documentary for the second series in which Griff Rhys-Jones did the voiceover, and he said, we always remember this, the blend is interesting, comedy and horror. And we were a bit dismayed by that, because it was a bit like we'd sort of gone to a shop and said, let's get some comedy and horror, or what's missing from contemporary comedy? I know, comedy and horror. Whereas in fact, it was just what made us laugh. It was just that very particular brew of stuff. We loved horror films as a distraction, but we also liked laughing about them. We liked laughing about ones that took themselves seriously, and we liked laughing with things like Theatre of Blood or Dr. Fives, which were consciously comic horrors, or Carry On Screaming, where it is an interesting blend. But we didn't set out to make it that. We just wanted to do what made us laugh, and then the simple vehicle of containing them in a town. It is literally that was how to put all these different random things together. But they're obviously hugely different in style. There are some big, broad fart jokes. There's exploding animals, and then there's some rather sad, quiet more Alan Bennett-esque stuff, another huge influence on us, with Les McQueen or Alvin Steele or whatever, so some of it is very horror oriented, and other stuff is more like the horror of embarrassment. A big influence of us actually was the Mike Leigh film Nuts in May, which we all used to regard as a horror movie, not as a sort of comic drama, because it's just about embarrassment and Britishness and this terrible couple of lentil weaving fools going on a camping holiday and then running up against the real world. It's sort of like a home counties version of Deliverance. Well, it was amazing, obviously, to work on the first season of the revived Doctor Who. It's not enough to say it was a dream come true. It was everything I'd ever wanted. I never thought it would happen. I wrote a couple of books in the dark time, the time of chaos, between the show coming off in 1989 and coming back in 2005, and I kept the flame alive along with hundreds of others. But I didn't actually think it would happen. I remember there was a very particular moment when, and it wasn't long before it did come back. In fact, it was the same year it was announced. We were going on holiday to Ireland, and we were driving to the ferry, and we passed a sign that said "World's Largest Doctor Who Exhibition" at a place called Llangollen, and I had never heard of this exhibition. We had a bit of time to kill, and I said, "Stop the car." And we went to this exhibition, which, extraordinary enough, was next to the Darpol factory. It used to make these not very accurate Doctor Who toys. And it was the last day of it. By amazing coincidence, it was closing down. And we went round it, and it was very sad. They were just, fly-blown cases with all kinds of random props. I remember they had Peter Davison's trousers adjusted for Colin Baker for the regeneration, in the same case as a bit of Anthony Ainley's costume, and then like a giant maggot or something. It was so random. But it had Bessie, which is incredible. And I sat in Bessie and had a photograph taken. But it felt, and I just watched it, it was sparsely populated, and a couple of parents dragging their baffled children around. I thought, well, that's it. We've finally reached the end now. There's not much steam left. It's just a memory now. And that was the summer of 2003. And incredibly, later that year, I got a phone call from Clayton Hickman, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "No, I'm in bed, I'm lying down." He said, "Doctor Who's coming back." And that was how it happened. And then, to my great joy, I knew Russell a little. He rang me up and asked me if I'd do the story about Charles Dickens. It was called, in the writer's brief, it was called The Name's Dickens, Charles Dickens, and it was basically about seances and things living in the walls, as I remember. And the rest was kind of up to me. And it was an amazing, it's 15 years ago now. It feels like yesterday in some ways and forever in others. It's just that the possibility of writing interior TARDIS and it actually happening, and this whole new world of things. God, I've got so many memories of that time, of the first script meeting, and getting the tube to White City and thinking, I used to fantasize about coming here and watching Doctor Who, and here it is, I'm working on it. I remember going to a sort of, what was it? It was a meal or something. I was at a club in London, and Mal Young, who was the executive producer for the first series, he had a video with the top 3 candidates for the Doctor on it, and he was just going, ha ha ha. There are so many things like that. And I remember going for a Chinese meal with Stephen Moffat, Paul Cornell, Rob Shearman, Russell, and talking about what the plans were, and then also going to a separate meal without Russell, just because it was already ganging up on each other, in a restaurant in Hammersmith called Shula, which is I think it's in The Empty Child. I think it was directly transposed, so it started to affect things. So it was a an amazing privilege, and to have then written, I don't know, like 10 or 11 episodes over the years for the subsequent Doctors was a dream come true. A fascinating journey for me, because obviously to some extent you have to treat it like a job of work, but because it's Doctor Who, it never stops being special. And it, sometimes you can get close to just thinking, I don't want to spoil the thing I love by having a tough time on it, because it is tough. It's a tough show to write, a tough schedule, but I never lost it. And actually, I ended up being in it 3 times, and my last act, as it were, playing the Brigadier's grandfather in a regeneration story with Peter Capaldi and David Bradley. David Bradley playing the first Doctor, and David Bradley having been William Hartnell in Invention, Space and Time, which is my great love letter to the whole experience, was kind of perfect. And I thought, well, that's probably time to stop, which is why I've now written a target book of the Crimson Horror. And why is it such a good vehicle for horror? Well, I would say the thing is about Doctor Who is a very special thing. Obviously, that's why it's still with us. Philip Hinchcliffe, the great Doctor Who producer, once said to me, and I never forgot this, he said, the thing is about the Doctor is a television hero. The roots of Doctor Who go deep into H.G. Wells and Sherlock Holmes, but Doctor Who is a television original, and that's a really good thing to think about. It's not an adaptation of something, it's its own thing. And it's, to quote a friend of mine, it's a cathedral made by many hands. An awful lot of clever people over the years have laid this stone on that stone, or had that idea. The wonderful things, I always think about that. They couldn't afford, if they could have afforded it, they would have had a big shiny early 60s flying saucer, but they couldn't afford it, so they came up with that. A broken down old police box, a domestic object which was supposed to change its shape and got stuck. That's beautiful. It's an incredibly British idea. And I love that sort of thing about Doctor Who. And the same sort of vein, the reason that horror works so well is, I think at its best, is the contrast between this sort of slightly homespun Britishness of things and a sort of rather weird idea. That's why the John Pertwee era, which is what I grew up with, John Pertwee was my Doctor, but that was almost exclusively earthbound stories, because there was a great frisson from seeing blank-faced astronauts walking down in the countryside, or shop window dummies coming to life, and weird things like that. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Doctor Who which is not that, so I said, in the past on alien planets, but somewhere in that is a magical thing, which means that you can get a kind of domestic horror onto the telly at tea time on a Sunday now. And I think that's really a very special achievement. Some of the things that have gone out in Doctor Who, and I don't mean Mary Whitehouse complaining things, but some of the ideas that have been smuggled onto children's television at tea time over the years have been quite extraordinary. And I remember vividly watching the rushes of Diana Rigg opening her dress to reveal that she had a red leech suckling on her throat, and thinking, that is the weirdest thing that will ever be on BBC One thus far. The Reichenbach Fall. Well, this episode, of course, was written by Steve Thompson, but this scene on the rooftop, we all worked on together. And then I remember actually sitting in the corridor outside the courtroom location in Swansea, where Moriarty was being tried, Stephen and I literally sitting on a bench next to each other, hammering out this massive scene, which was the climax of the whole thing, but it had to do so many things. It had to sort of make sense. We had to kill off Moriarty. We had to leave Sherlock with no option. We had to have it was a version, of course, of the waterfall, the Reichenbach Fall, but it was our kind of up-to-date version. It was a real challenge. We actually started shooting it and ran out of time and had to come back quite a long time later. It was very threatening weather, and there was a fear that we were going to get struck by lightning on the top of the roof. I remember that. but we just basically said we can't do this justice. We've got about 4 hours to do it or something. We ran out of time. So we had to come back for an entire day, during which time we rethought some of the costume. Remember, Moriarty's costume we changed. But it was a really good chance to sort of regroup and think, right, what exactly do we have to do? It was a... And then we had obviously no idea it was going to do what it did. We were hopeful. And we even sort of teased that we didn't know whether there was going to be a third series until we tweeted, literally watching it. Of course, it's going to be a third series. But watching the reaction, we were watching at Martin Freeman's house, and the moment that dead Sherlock is suddenly standing by the graveside as John walks away, all our phones just went buzz, 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 And it was a really thrilling feeling. But then the interesting thing was, 2 years later, it had been a thing all around the world, people speculating, and we knew we couldn't just sort of explain it and go, oh, move on. Actually, oddly, the way we had with the previous cliffhanger with Moriarty in the swimming pool, where we sort of got away with it with a joke and just moved on, it was like, well, we've got to sort of have a solution here. So we came with the idea of having multiple fake solutions and enjoying it. So you appear to be seeing what's going on, and I was sort of imagining people going, what? Are you kidding? And then actually literally Lestrade says, bollocks. And then you're back and Anderson is explaining his outlandish theories, etc., etc. And so we sort of did it 3 or 4 times, really, and possibly gave the solution for how he did it.
It was easy. Now I got to go back to playing with the ordinary people. And it turns out you're ordinary, just like all of them.
But, I mean, the joy of this was, casting Andrew versus Benedict, and just the sheer, kind of chutzpah of his performance. We talked a lot. I remember, I've got such strong memories, strange fragmentary memories. I remember standing in a corridor in Cardiff with Andrew trying to work out what he should wear and persuading him to do Moriarty Irish. He was very resistant at first. But I see, Moriarty's an Irish name, and there isn't apart from Leo McKern in The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, there isn't an Irish Moriarty. And I said, we can do something with this, it's quite interesting. But the key to him is he is really, really mad. And he, in order to prove his point, he will die. There's a wonderful line. I'm not a big comics fan, but I remember a line in The Dark Knight Returns, the famous Frank Miller Batman comic, when Batman strangles the Joker after all these years, and he does kill him, but it says something like, something left him and it rustled as it left. I remember going, oh God, that's good. Really. So we wanted something that's almost supernatural about Moriarty. He's so brainy and so malevolent, but also kind of childish and gleeful. But he's prepared to blow his own brains out just to prove a point and leave his victim in a perilous, fatal situation. So he thinks. But a huge amount of it was down to the casting of everyone in the show and how blessed we were to get everyone together like that. And make stars of, Andrew Benedict. And it was an amazing kind of fulcrum of talent at the top of their game. A huge thank you again to Read Pop fans and MCM Comic Con fans for your questions, and don't forget tickets are available for an exclusive Q&A, details somewhere embedded within this video. I think